Your thermostat is set to 71 degrees. You didn't even think about it. Outside, it might be freezing. You don't care. You're in a t-shirt. Strip all of that away. No thermostat, no walls, no jacket, except what you could make with your own two hands. Now put yourself outside, in the dead of a European winter, 300,000 years ago. That wasn't an emergency for your ancestors. That was Tuesday. Here's the terrifying part. Your body starts failing almost immediately. Drop your core temperature 2 degrees, and you're shivering uncontrollably. Drop it 4 degrees, and your thinking turns to fog. Drop it 7 degrees, and you lose consciousness. Drop it 9 degrees, and your heart simply stops. That's the entire window between alive and dead. Less than 10 degrees Celsius. And your ancestors lived on the edge of that window every single night for 300,000 years straight. We know they survived. You're here. The real question is how. To understand what they were up against, picture the world itself. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, average global temperatures sat about 6 degrees Celsius colder than today. That number sounds small. It isn't. That's the difference between London as a living city and London buried under a kilometer of solid ice. Massive ice sheets stretched across huge portions of North America, Europe, and Asia. Sea level sat about 120 meters lower than now, low enough that Britain was physically attached to mainland Europe, and a vast plain called Beringia connected Siberia to Alaska. The map of the world looked nothing like the one you grew up with, and the landscape wasn't empty. It was full of enormous, dangerous life. Woolly mammoths, cave bears, woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions larger than any lion alive today, Irish elk carrying antlers that stretched nearly 4 meters across. These animals were simultaneously the greatest threat your ancestors faced and their single most critical resource. And it wasn't just Homo sapiens out there facing all of this. Neanderthals had already been surviving Ice Age winters for tens of thousands of years before modern humans ever showed up to compete with them for the same frozen ground. Start with the body itself, because winter survival begins there. The moment temperatures drop, your blood vessels near the skin clamp shut. That's called vasoconstriction. Warm blood gets pulled inward toward your organs, and your fingers, your toes, your nose get sacrificed first. That's not discomfort. That's triage. Your body deciding in real time what's worth saving. Next comes shivering. Involuntary muscle contractions burning through your calorie reserves at nearly 5 times your resting rate, which means a shivering human is a human on a countdown. Burn through your fat stores and you run out of shivering. Run out of shivering and the cold wins. But here's what almost nobody knows. Your body doesn't just fight the cold, it adapts to it, and not across generations. Within a single season. In 2014, physiologist Wouter van Marken-Lichtenbelt at Maastricht University found that repeated cold exposure activates something called brown fat. Unlike regular fat, brown fat doesn't just get burned for energy, it generates heat directly, like a built-in furnace, sitting around your neck and upper back. And the more you're exposed to cold, the more efficient that furnace becomes. Your ancestors were cold every winter for decades straight. Their bodies weren't fighting the cold from zero each year. They were tuned to it. That biological machinery is still inside you right now. It's just switched off, because you've probably not been properly cold in months. Adaptation buys you a little room. It doesn't save you at -30 with no shelter, no clothing, and no fire. So let's talk about fire, the oldest technology your ancestors had. The earliest confirmed evidence of controlled fire comes from Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa. Archaeologist Francesco Berna found burned bone and ash 1,000,000 years deep inside that cave, somewhere wildfire could never naturally reach. That means it was built deliberately, 1,000,000 years before Homo sapiens even existed. But Wonderwerk is in South Africa. Mild winters. The real test came when early humans pushed north, into what's now England, Germany, northern China, places where the temperature routinely dropped below zero. At Beech's Pit in Suffolk, England, archaeologist John Gowlett uncovered structured hearths, dated to roughly 400,000 years ago. Not scattered ash from a lucky spark. Built, maintained, reused, over and over. That distinction matters more than it sounds. A fire you stumble into is warmth. A fire you build on purpose is strategy. And fire didn't just warm you. It cooked food, unlocking far more usable energy than eating it raw. Some researchers argue this is exactly what allowed the human brain to grow as large as it did, trading gut tissue for brain tissue, because cooking did the digestive heavy lifting our bodies no longer had to do. Fire kept predators at bay through 16-hour winter nights. It dried soaked clothing before hypothermia could set in. And it lit the darkness long enough for people to talk, to teach, to stay sane through months of enforced confinement. Losing your fire in a storm, with no way to restart it, could be a death sentence, which means the person who kept the flame alive, night after night, may have been one of the most valuable members of the entire group, not the strongest hunter, the firekeeper. Fire only works if you're standing next to it. Step away, and the cold comes right back. Your ancestors needed something that held warmth against their bodies, even while they moved, hunted, or slept. They needed clothes. And clothing barely survives in the archaeological record. Leather rots. fiber dissolves. For decades, researchers could only guess when real clothing began. Then, in 2011, molecular biologist Melissa Toops found an answer in the strangest possible place: lice. Body lice, unlike head lice, can only survive in the seams of fabric. By tracing when body lice split off from head lice genetically, her team estimated the moment humans started wearing clothes regularly. The answer? Roughly 170,000 years ago, long before modern humans even left Africa. That's not decoration. That's survival infrastructure, and it got sophisticated fast. At the Sun Here site in Russia, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, 2 children were buried wearing thousands of individually carved ivory beads, sewn directly into their garments. Researchers reconstructing the clothing found a layered system: a snug inner layer against the skin, a middle layer for insulation, and a tough outer shell for wind and water. Hoods, trousers, boots. That's essentially the exact layering system modern mountaineering guides still teach, figured out 34,000 years ago through nothing but trial, error, and death. The hides themselves were processed using brain tanning, a method using the animal's own brain tissue to soften and preserve the skin. Nothing was wasted, because in that world, nothing could afford to be. The Inuit took this principle to its absolute limit. Anthropologist Igor Krupnik documented traditional Inuit clothing made from 2 layers of caribou skin, fur turned inward on one layer and outward on the other. That combination alone could keep a person alive at minus 50 degrees Celsius, using almost no extra calories to stay warm. No synthetic fiber, no lab, just an intimate understanding of animal material refined over centuries. Fire and clothing manage the cold while you're awake and moving. The most dangerous hours are the ones you're asleep, when your metabolism slows and your body's heat production drops for 8 straight hours. That's where shelter comes in. Caves helped when they were available. Sites like Lascaux and Altamira, famous for their paintings, also show hearths, food waste, and dense layers of tools, evidence of long winter occupation, not brief stopovers. But caves are rare, unevenly scattered across the landscape, and winter doesn't wait for you to find one. So people built. In 1965, archaeologists excavating a site in what's now Ukraine uncovered something extraordinary. 4 structures built entirely from the bones of woolly mammoths, not scavenged and stacked at random. Chosen. Jaw bones arranged into interlocking arches, long limb bones used as roof supports, skulls placed deliberately to anchor the walls. Each structure used remains from somewhere between 95 and 149 individual mammoths. Archaeologist Olga Soffer, who spent years studying the site, concluded these structures were likely covered in mammoth hide, creating enclosed spaces that could be heated well above the freezing temperatures outside. These weren't caves, they were houses, engineered from the largest land animals on Earth, by people who built shelter where the landscape refused to give them any. Not every group tried to simply outlast winter in one spot. Some left entirely. Reindeer migrate hundreds of kilometers between summer and winter range. So do bison. Salmon runs hit specific rivers at specific times, producing a massive brief window of abundance. Human groups tracking these animals weren't going to sit still in a stripped bare landscape while every food source moved somewhere else. Across Upper Paleolithic Europe, the pattern shows up clearly. Groups spent summers in upland areas, then moved down into sheltered river valleys for winter, where the terrain blocked the worst wind, water stayed at least partly unfrozen, and prey animals were pushed toward the same lower ground for the exact same reasons. This wasn't wandering. Stone tools recovered from certain sites were made from rock sourced hundreds of kilometers away, which only makes sense if these groups were moving along the same established routes, year after year, and knew exactly where they were going, and exactly when they'd be back. They were carrying mental maps of enormous stretches of land, refined and passed down across generations. Picture a winter camp on that same Ukrainian steppe, 15,000 years ago, February, minus 18 degrees outside. The sun rises around 8 in the morning and sets before 4 in the afternoon, leaving barely 8 hours of usable daylight and 16 hours of darkness. 25 people, maybe 30, packed into 2 mammoth bone structures, each one warmed by a central hearth burning dried dung and bone, because on that treeless steppe, wood barely exists. Near the fire, the air might reach 5 or 6 degrees. Cold by your standards. Comfortable by theirs. People sit close together, layered in fur, because shared body heat isn't sentiment, it's physics. Outside, wind cuts across the open plain hard enough to drop the effective temperature past minus 30. Nobody steps out unless they absolutely have to. So what do you do with 16 hours of darkness? Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent years studying exactly this question, comparing daytime and nighttime conversation among the modern-day Kungsan of the Kalahari, one of the closest living parallels we have to how ancient foragers actually lived. Her findings, published in 2014, were striking. During the day, conversation was almost entirely practical. Where the food was, who did what, who wasn't pulling their weight. But at night, around the fire, over 80% of conversation turned into stories. Myths about the origin of the world, tales of legendary hunts, jokes, group history stretching back further than anyone alive could personally remember. That firelight wasn't idle chatter. It was the transmission system for culture itself. the way a group remembered exactly who it was, and passed that memory forward. Winter, with its long, dark hours and forced closeness, wasn't a pause in social life. It might have been the most important part of it. Cold is a manageable problem. Calories are not. Winter is a season of constant energy deficit. Your body needs more just to stay warm, and the environment gives you less. That gap only grows the longer the cold holds. In warm climates, hunter-gatherers solve food scarcity by simply moving somewhere else. But in the far north, in deep winter, that option often disappears. Distances are too great. Weather too dangerous. Moving can burn more calories than it saves. So instead, your ancestors brought summer forward with them. At Wonderwerk Cave in Israel, archaeologist Ran Barkai found evidence that animal fat was being deliberately processed and saved, not eaten immediately at the kill site, dating back roughly 400,000 years. That's not instinct. That's forward planning, applied to biology. By 30,000 years ago, storage had gotten seriously sophisticated. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, archaeologist Jiří Svoboda documented storage pits dug below the frost line, deep enough to stay cold even in summer, and packed with processed meat. A refrigerator built entirely out of geology. Your ancestors didn't understand bacteria. They didn't need to. They noticed that meat buried in frozen ground stayed edible for months, while meat left in open air didn't. The mechanism didn't matter, the pattern did. This wasn't a one-off trick either. The Nenets, reindeer herders who've lived above the Arctic Circle for thousands of years, still bury slaughtered reindeer whole in permafrost after the autumn kill, pulling out sections as winter goes on. A freezer that costs nothing to run, because the ground does the work. Your ancestors did the same with mammoths, horses, bison. A single adult mammoth could weigh up to 6 tons, much of it fat, and could theoretically provide something in the range of 500,000 calories, enough to carry a group of 25 people through weeks of deep winter. But hunting one wasn't simple. These were animals large enough to kill you without trying. Groups used bogs to trap them, ambushed them at river crossings, coordinated with fire and noise to drive them toward planned kill sites. That level of coordination alone tells you these weren't desperate people improvising. They were planning campaigns. Once you had the meat, you still had to make it last. Thin strips were dried over fire or in the brutal, dry winter air itself, stripping out moisture and stretching shelf life for months. Rendered fat got stored inside containers made from animal bladders and stomach linings. And in what might be the Ice Age's answer to a modern energy bar, evidence suggests people were making something close to pemmican. Dried, pounded meat mixed with rendered fat, and sometimes dried berries, dense with calories, and able to last for months without spoiling. Autumn wasn't a season of rest. It was frantic, coordinated, large-scale food production, an entire community working toward one single goal, having enough saved to make it to spring. But storing food creates a new problem entirely. A cache of meat buried for winter is worth killing for, to wolves, to bears, to rival groups. Anthropologist David Ertl spent decades studying the link between resource defense and social structure in forager societies, and concluded that the demands of winter storage were likely a major driver behind the strict egalitarian norms found in nearly every known hunter-gatherer culture. If one person controls the cache, everyone else starves. So the cache gets shared. Sharing becomes the rule, and breaking that rule becomes one of the most serious offenses a group can punish. That instinct hasn't gone anywhere. It's the same discomfort you feel watching someone go hungry in a world that clearly has enough food to go around. That feeling isn't something you were taught. It's older than agriculture. Older than cities, possibly older than language itself. It was carved into your species by 300,000 years of winters that punished hoarding and rewarded sharing with survival. None of this worked without deep specialization inside the group. Someone had to know precisely how to butcher a massive animal to pull every usable calorie from it. The organs, the marrow, the fat most people would overlook entirely. Someone had to know which roots still held nutrition a meter under snow and exactly where to dig for them. And someone, usually an elder, had to remember what the group did 15 winters ago when conditions looked exactly this bad, and which valley still had game when everywhere else had gone empty. That person wasn't a burden on the group. She was a library, and an irreplaceable one. Even the art may have served a purpose beyond decoration. The cave paintings at Lascaux, Chauvet, and Altamira, created somewhere between 40,000 and 17,000 years ago, depict horses, bison, mammoths, and reindeer with startling anatomical precision and specific behavioral detail. Some researchers now argue these weren't purely spiritual or symbolic. They may have functioned as a kind of visual database, a record of which animals appeared in a given territory, when and how they behaved, maintained and updated across generations on the most permanent storage medium available to anyone at the time: solid rock. Here's what should actually stop you. None of these strategies just solved a biology problem. They built the entire architecture of human society. Long nights around a fire produced storytelling, which produced cultural memory, which let knowledge travel across generations without a single word ever being written down. Defending a shared cache produced trust, and rules, And the earliest form of reciprocity, planning a season of storage in advance, produced long-term thinking and the capacity to sacrifice comfort now for survival later. Every one of those traits, the sharing instinct, the group loyalty, the drive to plan ahead, the impulse to gather around a fire and tell a story, has a plausible origin in winter. Not the only origin, but a real one. Winter wasn't just something your ancestors survived. Winter built them. So look at where you're sitting right now. You adjusted your thermostat without a second thought. You're wearing a t-shirt in the middle of winter. There's food in your fridge that will last you a week without any effort on your part. The cold is out there somewhere, behind glass, behind insulation, behind a gas line running under your street. Managed so completely you haven't thought about it once today. But your body hasn't forgotten any of it. The brown fat around your neck is still there, just waiting to switch on. The instinct to pull in close to other people when it gets cold, to share what you have, to tell stories in the dark, that's not culture, that's biology. Shaped by hundreds of thousands of winters you will genuinely never have to face. Your ancestors sat inside a mammoth bone house on a frozen steppe at minus 18 degrees and told each other stories until the fire burned low. And they made it through the night, and the night after that, and the winter after that. For 300,000 years of winters, they made it through every single time, until eventually you happened. If this made you look at your own thermostat differently, subscribe and tell me in the comments, fire, food storage, or clothing, which one do you think mattered the most?